Aloha! This is chapter 24.1, and we're going to take an overview of neocolonialism. So, what's the difference between neocolonialism and regular colonialism? Well, regular colonialism or old colonialism would have been starting in the 1500s all the way up until the end of the 1700s when the United States wins its independence. So the old colonialism would have been the Americas, North and South America. But neocolonialism really involves Africa and Asia. Their colonial time period starts later. And part of the reason for that is Africa had not even been explored by Europeans until the late 1800s. And Asia had strong civilizations there already, and it took a long time for the Europeans to finally conquer those civilizations to create their own empires. So we're going to talk about types of colonies and motivations for colonizing. So here we go. The first thing we need to do is define what imperialism actually is. And your textbook gives the definition of imperialism as the domination of one country by another country, either politically, economically, socially, or all of those things. And so that, because there are different types of imperialism, there are going to be different types of colonies. One type would be a protectorate, which is not directly ruled by an imperial power, but is indirectly ruled by an imperial power. So the regional ruler or the local ruler still has dominion over the territory, but the empire controls the ruler, the regional ruler. And then you have something called a sphere of influence. And that would be where outside power or the imperial power has economic influence over the region, usually through trade, or they have made treaties with the people that are living there. They have a superior relationship with the peoples living there so that they are benefiting more from that. So that would be imperialism. That would be a sphere of influence. But finally, we have the traditional colony, where there's political control by the imperial power over the colony. What countries were involved in the neo-colonialism? Well, of course, your guess, you were right. Yes, England. They had the largest empire during the neo-colonial time period, but other European powers were competing for hegemony over regions of the world. So we have France, who is also a very strong imperial power. Then you have the Netherlands. They also had a large territory. And Spain had, by this point, really died down as one of the main contenders for empire. They are going to lose their colonies in South America right about the middle of the 1800s, or earlier 1800s. And from then on, they are no longer a contender. They do have one final empire holding in the Philippines, and they're going to lose that to a new imperial power rising on the scene, and that would be the United States. So in 1898, they're going to lose a war with the United States, and they're going to lose the Philippines to the United States, as well as their last holdings in the Western Hemisphere, so that would be Cuba. Okay, well, just like as the old colonialism, the main motivations for colonizing or for the creating an empire was economic, because you're looking for natural resources, you're looking for markets to sell your products to, and you have a lot of entrepreneurial investors who want to find places to expand their businesses. So economic needs were one of the main reasons why countries began to seek new places to colonize. But there's also the political aspect of it. Each European country that was an imperial power was competing with the others to try to create the biggest empire. It was kind of just that simple. And also they were looking for strategic spots on the globe to dominate. England was probably the most successful at this. So if you look at all the points on the continents, England probably owned the point because they saw that as necessary for their naval supremacy of the world. So South Africa, in South America, they owned the Falkland Islands, they owned the Suez Canal, they owned the Saudi Arabian Peninsula in the later part of the 1800s, early 1900s, when the Ottoman Empire crumbles. Yeah, so basically they looked for places strategically to put a naval base and also to prevent other European powers from controlling the region. And this is very true for Africa. When we look at 14.2 and we look at the scramble for Africa, a lot of the motivation for owning Africa was simply to keep other European powers from owning that bit of Africa. It wasn't because Africa, that part of Africa, was in any way economically valuable to the colonizing country. Yeah, they did have some natural resources, but developing the country to the point where you could extract those resources was sketchy. There was also a humanitarian motivation for expansion. Missionaries saw their calling as spreading the gospel to all the parts of the world, and having it colonized, having a region colonized, made their job easier to some extent. So missionaries often partnered with colonial empire builders in order to develop regions so that they could bring the gospel to people. This was definitely true for Africa. It was also somewhat true in India as well. The first part of the colonization experience of India, missionaries are not allowed to go into India. When India transfers from being a privately owned enterprise to being part of the government of the British government controlling and administrating India, they're going to allow a lot of missionaries to come in. So that was one of the motivations, humanitarian and religious. We saw doctors and officials who tried to spread Western civilization. They felt like Western civilization was superior to the civilization that already existed there, and so they were trying to take away the old culture and to implant the Western civilization culture. And this kind of is spun off from an underlying belief that stems from something called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism came from the original Darwinian theory of evolution that, just as the species is evolving, societies or civilizations or ethnic groups are evolving as well. And some ethnic groups, some races, are more evolved than others. This is the theory of the social Darwinists, which we really find very offensive today, but that's what they were believing. So this was the underpinning philosophy behind a lot of the imperial expansion. They felt like the Western civilization, white races, were more advanced, more evolved than the racial groups that they were going to colonize. And so they saw this as a blessing to the people that they were colonizing because they were giving them civilization, which, wow, that's really, we do not agree with that today. And the sad thing is there were some cultures that were damaged by this kind of imperialism. Hawaii is an example of that because the outlawing of use of Hawaiian language and culture, squashing that culture down and forcing non-Hawaiian culture or the Western culture to be practiced has caused some damage to the native Hawaiian culture. Neo-imperialism, stretching from 1870s all the way up until the beginning of World War I, and even going through World War I, and finally ending in World War II. It was probably Woodrow Wilson's idea at the end of World War I with his 14 points that he's going to suggest when they make the treaty that ends World War I, that's going to initiate the beginning of the end of imperialism. Because he is going to suggest that these colonies have the right to self-determination. They should be allowed to govern themselves. And of course, this was very, very reluctantly agreed to by the European powers. And in fact, they did their best to kind of ignore that aspect of Wilson's ideas. But eventually, they're going to be forced to give up those colonies. And so after World War II, we're going to see a wave of new nations being formed, which is really setting it up for what it's like today, where we have many, many different nations that form the United Nations. What enabled European nations, imperial nations, to be able to take over the rest of the world? Well, first of all, you guys have already guessed it. It was industrialization. Really, it gave them the tools that they needed to be able to expand. One of the big things was the Maxim gun. This was an improvement to the regular guns, which actually the civilizations that they were going to conquer already had guns. But this Maxim gun it was just basically a machine gun, and it totally wiped the floor with just a regular gun. So it gave the Westerners a huge advantage. Also, they were going into regions in neocolonialism. They were going into regions where the civilizations that existed there were on their way downhill. They were already crumbling, and the Western imperial powers were able to capitalize on the weakness of these old ancient civilization. So, for example, the Ottoman Empire that had been around since the Middle Ages and was definitely on its deathbed by the end of the 1800s. Then you had China with the Qing dynasty that was also crumbling. It was quite weak. And Africa, it was weakened because of there was no unity within Africa, and the slave trade, which had been going on for centuries, had greatly depopulated, demoralized the continent of Africa and made it very easy to conquer, well, relatively easy to conquer because of those weaknesses. And on the other side, the Western imperial powers were very systematic. They were organized. They had better weapons, better technology. They had developed new medicines to help them be able to deal with the environmental hazards. Africa had a huge problem with malaria, where they discovered quinine, which is a chemical found in plants that you can distill and create quinine liquid, and you take it and it helps to reduce the effects of malaria, and it can also prevent malaria. So this enabled a lot of Europeans to be able to finally penetrate into Africa and explore it and conquer it and claim it for European powers. There were, of course, those who really disagreed with this imperialization. They were adamantly against imperializing countries that already had great civilizations. They felt like it was arrogant of Europeans. They also felt like it was immoral. In the late 1800s in Europe, you were seeing a lot of democracy is being expanded. Nations are developing more democratic ways of governance. And so to have those same countries like France that had created a democracy go in and conquer territory and people whom they would not allow to vote, they didn't see them as equals, human-wise, as equals with themselves. That kind of goes against the whole Enlightenment idea of equality. And it's kind of crazy how they would totally ignore that aspect of their own civilizational goals of freedom and equality and democracy, and yet they would subjugate other peoples and not allow them to have that. So the two main empire builders were France and England. They were competing with each other. They had very different styles of rule. France wanted to rule directly. They usually made the colonies a province within France. Like they would give them those kind of privileges. Whereas Britain tried to rule with a lighter touch. They allowed the local rulers to stay in power, and then they just ruled the rulers. So the British offered education to the children of the elite in the colonies. And they were hoping to influence the children with British culture and civilization, and then that culture would then be passed down through the elite cultures of the colonies. And their goal was to try to create little enclaves of British rule or British culture within their colonies. They were both fairly strategic in the way that they went about colonizing.